I remember walking into my mother-in-law's living room that evening, trying to force a smile despite the knot of unease twisting in my stomach. The house smelled faintly of lilies and expensive candles, the kind she always insisted I notice but never really appreciated. Everyone was gathered, laughing and clinking glasses, celebrating what I assumed was just another ordinary family gathering. I thought I could blend in, keep my head down, and avoid the subtle judgments that always lingered in her eyes. That illusion shattered the moment she handed me a neatly wrapped box with a flourish, grinning like she'd just dealt a winning hand. Inside were divorce papers. My hands shook, my vision blurred, and for a heartbeat I couldn't breathe. It wasn't just the papers. It was the deliberate, theatrical way she presented them. The room fell silent, or maybe it was just my ears, but the whispers, the stifled laughter, the judging stares, they all pierced me. Humiliation rose in my chest, sharp and suffocating. Betrayal coiled inside me, cold and heavy, as if every happy memory with this family had been a lie. I wanted to scream, to throw the papers at her feet, to vanish, but I stayed frozen, pretending composure while my mind raced. How could she be so cruel, so calculated? How could the woman who raised my husband treat me like this? My pulse pounded, my stomach lurched, and I realized that nothing would ever be the same. In that instant, humiliation transformed into a spark, angry, small, but persistent. I clenched my jaw, breathing through the panic, knowing that this moment was only the beginning. Little did she know her act had lit a fire in me, and I would never be the same powerless person she expected me to be. As I sat in my car later that night, clutching the divorce papers like they were a weight pressing into my chest, my mind refused to stay in the present. Memories began to surface, small moments that had always made me feel less than. The way she praised my sister-in-law for trivial accomplishments, while barely acknowledging my efforts at holidays. The subtle sighs when I tried to offer help. The way my husband's achievements were celebrated more loudly than mine. Everything I had brushed off now looked like a pattern. I remembered last Christmas, the way she insisted my husband open his gift first, smiling at him while barely making eye contact with me. I recalled family dinners where my ideas were dismissed or laughed at, the way my suggestions were interesting, but ultimately ignored. Each flashback made my chest tighten. It wasn't just the divorce papers. It was a lifetime of being undervalued, dismissed, and overlooked. I had thought I was imagining things, that maybe I was too sensitive, but now it was undeniable. Her favoritism toward others, her constant microaggressions, and her pointed criticisms had shaped the way I felt about myself. For years I had tried to bend, to fit in, to be the agreeable daughter-in-law who never caused waves. And yet, despite my efforts, she had chosen to humiliate me publicly. The betrayal wasn't sudden. It had been brewing silently, a poison slowly seeping into my life until that night, when it finally reached its peak. I felt anger simmering beneath the hurt, a bitter realization that I had allowed this to happen for too long. The person I had been, compliant, forgiving, and eager to please, was no longer enough to protect me. Something inside me shifted, a quiet but firm resolve that I wouldn't let her control my life anymore. I didn't yet know what form it would take, but the seed of revenge had been planted, the flashes of past humiliations intertwined with the present moment, creating a clarity I hadn't felt before. She had underestimated me all these years, and that mistake would become her undoing. My heart ached, but beneath the pain, determination began to rise, steady and unrelenting, preparing me for the battle I now knew I had to fight. I drove home in silence, the night air pressing against my windshield, but inside, my thoughts were anything but calm. I kept replaying the moment she handed me the divorce papers, the cruel, smug smile frozen in my mind, and with each replay, old memories clawed their way back. There were the subtle insults I had dismissed as jokes, the way she always commented on my clothes as nice, for a budget, or how she praised my sister-in-law for achievements I had worked just as hard to reach. Birthdays, holidays, family dinners, every event had its small moments of exclusion. The way she would hand my husband a gift first, linger on his side of the table, barely acknowledge me, as if my presence was a minor inconvenience. I remembered the Thanksgiving when I had spent hours preparing a feast, only to have her shrug and say, "It's fine, I guess," while gushing over my brother-in-law's store-bought dessert. My husband had barely noticed. I realized with a cold clarity that these weren't isolated incidents. They were patterns, little fractures that had eroded my self-worth over years. And yet I had forgiven, rationalized, and minimized them, believing that family should be endured, not challenged. But the divorce papers had changed everything. They were a punctuation mark on years of subtle cruelty, a public confirmation that I was undervalued in the eyes of someone who should have respected me. The sting of betrayal was sharper than ever, a combination of humiliation, anger, and a bitter awakening. I felt a mix of sorrow and fury as I acknowledged the truth. I had been invisible to them, dismissed at every turn, and yet now I had the chance to rewrite the narrative. For the first time, the weight of all those small slights ignited something fierce within me, a desire not just to survive their disdain, but to reclaim my dignity in a way they would never see coming. I called my closest friends that night, my voice trembling even though I tried to sound calm. As soon as they picked up, the words tumbled out. Divorce papers, my mother-in-law, the public humiliation. It all spilled like a dam breaking. They listened, shocked, offering comfort, disbelief, and outrage in equal measure. "I can't believe she did that," one of them said, her voice shaking. "That's cruel and calculated." Hearing their anger mirrored mine, it was like a spark igniting a fire I hadn't fully admitted to myself yet. I went over every detail, every look, every comment from that night, dissecting it for evidence of intent. The more I talked, the clearer it became that this wasn't just thoughtless cruelty. It was deliberate, designed to embarrass and belittle me. Tears came, and I let them, letting the sadness and hurt wash over me while my friends held space for my emotions. But beneath the sorrow, anger began to coil like a living thing, growing sharper and more focused. For the first time, I admitted it to myself. I wanted her to feel a fraction of the humiliation she had caused me. Revenge was no longer just a fleeting thought. It was a quiet, insistent pulse at the edge of my mind. My friends encouraged me, not to act recklessly, but to channel my outrage into something purposeful, something that would restore my dignity. As I hung up the phone, the sadness lingered, but the fire remained, steady and warm. I began imagining scenarios where I could reclaim control, subtly expose the hypocrisy, and turn the tables without compromising myself. That night, between tears and quiet fury, I realized that my humiliation could be transformed into power, and that realization became the first step toward the careful, deliberate plan I knew I would have to execute. The next few days were a blur of quiet determination. I spent hours at my laptop, researching, making notes, and quietly mapping out what I could do without raising suspicion. Every interaction, every conversation, every slip of arrogance from my mother-in-law was cataloged in my mind, a puzzle piece in the strategy I was beginning to form. I reached out to trusted friends and allies subtly, feeling out connections that could help me navigate the social circles she cared so much about. I didn't want reckless revenge. I wanted precision, subtlety, and impact. I started to notice opportunities I'd ignored before. Fundraisers she attended, charity boards she adored, social events where her influence mattered most. Each became a potential stage where the right move could shift perception entirely. At the same time, I reflected on my own strengths, the skills I'd honed over years, the work ethic, intelligence, and charm that she had always underestimated. I realized I wasn't powerless. I had the tools in mind to turn this humiliation into a story of victory. Late at night, I imagined small victories, quiet adjustments that would make her misjudge me again and again until the moment of revelation arrived. Each scenario fueled my determination, and I began drafting a loose plan, a series of steps that would allow me to regain control and expose her arrogance. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming the dignity and respect that had been denied to me for so long. With each passing day, my resolve strengthened, and I felt a calm clarity I hadn't known in years. I was no longer just the wronged daughter-in-law. I was a strategist, quietly gathering pieces, waiting for the perfect moment to turn the tide. And in that patience, I found power, the kind that didn't shout but whispered until it became impossible to ignore. After the divorce papers, everything changed in the small, poisonous ways that make a life feel unsteady. At family dinners, conversations shifted mid-sentence when I entered the room, like someone had pressed mute on my voice. My mother-in-law would direct stories away from me, instinctively turning the spotlight toward whoever pleased her. She started making those little pointed compliments to others. "Oh, you always know the best designers," while turning to me with a patronizing, "That dress is nice." Social invitations became a minefield. I was included in the guest list, but always seated at the edge of conversations, given the least flattering chores when hosting, or assigned the helpful role that ensured I moved in the background. At a charity luncheon she organized, she introduced me as my daughter-in-law, who helps out sometimes, as if my contributions were optional and unremarkable. People smiled, nodded, and moved on. Each slight was a small cut, and they added up faster than I expected. Public moments of snubbing were the worst. At a neighborhood wine tasting, she loudly praised a neighbor's success story while making a pointed joke about my simpler tastes. Laughter circled the table like a slow, cruel tide, and I felt my cheeks burn. My husband offered a half-hearted apology, distracted and embarrassed, and I realized how alone I was in that room of familiar faces. The world they inhabited accepted her tone and let it slide, while I sat collecting the residue of her disdain. Even the children felt the shift. My son noticed her preference, mimicking her attention toward his cousin and unconsciously copying her dismissal of my ideas. It hurt in a way that made me collapse inward. I had always tried to shield him from family drama, but I watched helplessly as the familial hierarchy seeped into his view. I began to play small acts of reassurance for him, soft smiles and late-night whispers to counterbalance the narrative she was constructing. At social gatherings, I started to test boundaries quietly, small, deliberate choices that made it harder for them to ignore me. I wore a dress she had once criticized and watched her reaction, a micro-expression of annoyance, a slight lift of an eyebrow, then smiled as if unaware. I made a point to finish a toast with warmth and confidence, gaining a few genuine nods that felt like currency. Each time she tried to undercut me, I didn't flare. I collected. I cataloged offenses and small victories like chess pieces, arranging possibilities in my mind. The tension wasn't theatrical. It lived in the pauses, the deliberate exclusions, the way someone would change the subject when I tried to share news. I learned to read those pauses like weather, to anticipate the next chill and prepare a response that conserved my dignity while scoring a subtle point. Friends who still saw me outside the family bubble offered different perspectives. "You're stronger than you think," one said. But inside that house, I was a different shape, cut to fit someone else's idea of who I should be. There were nights when exhaustion hit me like a wave, and I wondered if endurance was all I had left. Then, in quieter moments, beneath my measured exterior, a plan continued to form. I watched how power moved in the room, who listened when she spoke, which compliments bought allegiance and which comments silenced dissent. The tiny indignities sharpened my attention rather than breaking me. I started to place myself where I might be seen differently. At the right table, in the right conversation, with the right smile. I practiced saying less and meaning more, turning small courtesies into social currency. Each strained encounter taught me where her armor lay, and with every lesson, my resolve hardened, and I prepared my quiet comeback. It started with something almost imperceptible, a move so small that nobody outside of me would have noticed, but inside, it felt monumental. I had quietly invested in a business opportunity my mother-in-law had scoffed at months before, one she considered beneath her notice. No one knew, not even my husband, that I had arranged the finances, made calls, and secured a small but meaningful stake that would grow steadily over the coming months. The day I received the first official statement showing the profits, I felt a surge of validation, unlike anything I had experienced. For once, I had power that was entirely my own, quiet, private, and undeniable. At the next family gathering, I let my confidence show subtly. I offered advice on a charity fundraiser she had organized, and she brushed me off with that familiar smirk, underestimating the depth of my preparation. It stung momentarily, but I let it slide, smiling politely and observing. That small dismissal, her underestimation, became my advantage. I could see her planning, calculating, always assuming I lacked influence or understanding, never realizing I had quietly begun to shift the balance. Later, during a casual conversation with a distant cousin, I mentioned an upcoming professional collaboration. My mother-in-law laughed, dismissing it as inconsequential. But in her laughter, there was a crack I hadn't noticed before, a hint that she didn't see me as a real threat. That crack was everything. I began to weave small displays of competence into everyday interactions, suggesting venues for family events, providing insight at social gatherings, or offering help in ways that highlighted my growing resources and knowledge. Each act was deliberate, designed to be just enough to catch attention without seeming showy. The shift was subtle but tangible. Friends who had remained loyal began noticing my confidence, complimenting me behind her back, and inadvertently building my social leverage. I could feel eyes turning toward me at gatherings, whispers of curiosity following my every word. It wasn't public humiliation, not yet, but the first hints of change were everywhere if you knew where to look. My mother-in-law, in her usual arrogance, still underestimated me, unaware that the quiet moves I had made were stacking, building toward a tipping point that would one day leave her scrambling to defend her position. For the first time in months, I felt the thrill of control. I was no longer a passive observer in the family hierarchy. I was shaping it, influencing it, with patience and precision. The fire she had ignited in me the night of that cruel gift had grown into strategy, and the taste of this small, early victory was intoxicating. It was proof that humiliation could be transformed into leverage, and that power, once reclaimed, could move quietly but decisively. At the next family brunch, I sat at the edge of the table, quietly sipping my coffee while the chatter swirled around me. My mother-in-law was in her element, directing conversation like a conductor, laughing at jokes and praising everyone but me. I caught snippets of dialogue, faint but unmistakable, that revealed cracks in her carefully maintained composure. "I don't know why she's even trying," one cousin whispered to another, glancing my way. "She'll never fit in here. You can see it." I forced a smile, letting them underestimate me while filing away every word. Across the table, my brother-in-law muttered, "Honestly, I don't think she's capable of managing that fundraiser like she claims. It's just ambition without experience." The words were casual, tossed out like breadcrumbs, but they revealed the subtle skepticism that I could exploit. Even my husband, sitting quietly beside me, seemed to doubt my ability to stand my ground against the family hierarchy. But I let it slide, letting them believe they were safe in their judgments. I overheard my mother-in-law leaning in toward a friend. "She's trying so hard to impress everyone, but you can see it. It just doesn't land. I've never trusted her judgment." Her voice was light, conversational, but the condescension was sharp enough to sting. Beneath the surface, though, I sensed vulnerability. Every word of doubt she uttered, every subtle laugh at my expense, was a fissure in the armor she had built around her social dominance. I responded with calm, measured smiles, nodding at opinions, offering gentle insights here and there, careful not to overstep, yet showing competence in subtle ways. Each time they dismissed me, they gave me more information about their biases, their insecurities, and their expectations. I began plotting quietly, recognizing patterns, timing, and triggers. The cracks were small, almost imperceptible, but visible enough to someone paying attention. And I was paying attention, with patience, focus, and growing anticipation. By the end of the brunch, I felt a quiet satisfaction. I hadn't confronted anyone yet, but I had watched, learned, and confirmed that the family underestimated me. The seeds of doubt were already taking root in their minds, and soon, those seeds would bear fruit in ways they never expected. My patience, observation, and subtle strategy were turning humiliation into leverage, and with each whispered judgment, my power grew, invisible but unstoppable. In the weeks leading up to my birthday, I threw myself into planning with a single purpose: to transform what had always been just another social obligation into a stage for subtle but undeniable power. I rented a venue that gleamed with understated elegance, not flashy, but impossible to ignore. Every detail was meticulously considered: the floral arrangements, the lighting, even the seating chart, which I designed to quietly influence the flow of conversation and control who would sit where. I invited only those whose presence could serve the narrative. People who mattered socially or professionally to my mother-in-law, ensuring that each interaction carried weight. I whispered hints of surprises to my friends and allies, careful to fuel curiosity without revealing anything. Invitations carried a sense of anticipation, subtle suggestions that this party would be unlike any before. I practiced conversations, measured my tone, and prepared to appear gracious, calm, and in control while simultaneously orchestrating the evening like a conductor guiding a symphony. Each interaction with my mother-in-law before the party was deliberate. I smiled politely at her attempts to belittle me in passing, nodding at her suggestions while subtly asserting my own. Every compliment she offered was counterbalanced by quiet confidence from me, small gestures that signaled I was no longer the timid, overlooked daughter-in-law. She still underestimated me, unaware that I was plotting moments that would showcase my influence and her misjudgment. Even the menu carefully chosen had hidden significance. Dishes referencing inside jokes, shared memories and subtle nods to my accomplishments. A quiet reminder of my intelligence, resourcefulness, and social leverage. The music, the lighting, even the arrangement of the dance floor was designed to encourage movement toward connections and conversations that would highlight my growing status. By the night of the party, anticipation was a tangible force in the air. Friends whispered about the surprises I had promised, and I felt their excitement intertwine with my own satisfaction. My mother-in-law, blissfully unaware, continued her rehearsed charm, thinking she maintained control, when in reality, every detail of the night had been orchestrated to expose her arrogance. The tension built steadily, a slow burn that would culminate in the moments I had planned with precision, turning a celebration of my birth into a spectacle of subtle but undeniable triumph. The night of the party arrived, and everything unfolded exactly as I had planned. I walked into the room wearing a dress that I knew would catch every eye, elegant, understated yet impossible to ignore, and the murmurs began immediately. Friends, family, and acquaintances leaned in, sensing that something was different, sensing that I was different. My mother-in-law, perched near the center of the room like a queen expecting reverence, scanned the crowd, and her eyes landed on me. For the first time in years, I caught the flicker of uncertainty in her expression, a micro-reaction that betrayed her composure. I began casually dropping hints about the recent developments in my life, allowing them to ripple subtly through conversations. I finally finalized that project with the consulting firm I've been working with, I mentioned in passing to a friend. Another guest, one whose approval my mother-in-law desperately sought, leaned in, eyes widening. I let the whispers do their work, letting curiosity and surprise spread before me. When I approached my mother-in-law, I kept my tone light and friendly, as if nothing had changed. But the reality was starkly different. I mentioned that I had managed a major philanthropic donation to a local charity, one that she had always wanted to sponsor herself. The name dropped casually, yet it carried weight, prestige, and influence. Her smile faltered just slightly, an imperceptible crack. But to me, it was a signal that the balance had shifted. The real shock came when I invited a few key social allies, people whose opinion she valued, to join me in a toast. They offered congratulations, admiration, and genuine respect for my accomplishments, subtly reinforcing my social standing. I watched my mother-in-law's posture stiffen, the faint tightness around her eyes betraying rising panic. She realized, perhaps for the first time, that I was no longer powerless, that her careful underestimation had been a mistake. I delivered a brief, elegant speech laced with charm, humility, and just enough emphasis on my recent successes to make an impression without appearing boastful. Laughter, nods, and applause followed naturally, but my eyes were fixed on her, observing the unraveling of the narrative she had controlled for years. Guests murmured about my achievements, whispered about the sophistication and thoughtfulness of the evening, and I could see her scanning the crowd for allies, only to find their attention quietly shifting to me. By the end of the speech, the panic in her eyes was undeniable. She tried to regain her composure, making polite conversation, but the room had already changed. The subtle shifts in attention, the quiet admiration of people she had long counted as her influence, and the realization that I had orchestrated the night, all of it left her off balance. For the first time, she was no longer the center of control, and the realization came too late to adjust. Every smile she offered felt forced, every compliment hollow, as the crowd's focus had quietly moved to me. The fire I had cultivated over months of careful planning had finally ignited, and the thrill of seeing the first cracks appear in her armor was intoxicating. The stage was set for the next, inevitable step, the climactic moment when humiliation, vindication, and power would collide. The moment I had envisioned for months arrived with a precision that made my heart race and my pulse steady all at once. The cake had been cut, champagne poured, and the room was buzzing with laughter, small talk, and the subtle energy of anticipation. I had ensured that everyone who mattered socially, professionally, or personally, especially those whose opinions my mother-in-law prized, was present. She moved through the crowd, smiling with practiced charm, confident that her dominance remained unchallenged. That confidence, that smug certainty, was the final ingredient I needed for the reveal. I waited until she was addressing a group of her closest allies, recounting some trivial family anecdote when I approached with casual elegance, my presence drawing attention naturally. I started by praising her for her decades of influence in the community, nodding to her social connections. But then I paused, letting my words sink, letting the tension build. "It's amazing how some people's reputations are built on perception rather than reality," I said lightly, my tone polite but pointed. A hush fell over the circle. Eyes darted between her and me. The first flicker of doubt appeared in her eyes, and I knew I had her exactly where I wanted. Then came the subtle unveiling. I revealed my own achievements, the business venture that had grown quietly but impressively, the philanthropic projects that had gained notice among mutual acquaintances, and the carefully cultivated alliances with influential community members. The room reacted naturally, soft gasps, murmurs of approval, and admiration that contrasted sharply with her faltering composure. The dramatic irony was complete. Everyone could see the shift, even if she hadn't yet accepted it herself. As the murmurs spread, I leaned in with a casual smile. "I suppose some people think they can define others' worth," I added, just loud enough for her to hear. "But reality has a funny way of rewriting expectations." She opened her mouth, but no words came. The applause and approving nods around me drowned out her attempts to regain control. Guests whispered to one another, acknowledging my poise, intelligence, and grace, while her aura of authority subtly cracked under the weight of their attention. The final blow came in the form of an innocent, casual remark from someone I had aligned with beforehand, a friend who knew the full story. "It's remarkable how quietly she's accomplished all this, without anyone noticing until now," they said, eyes meeting mine. The crowd shifted subtly toward me, nodding, smiling, impressed. My mother-in-law's forced laughter, her attempts to redirect attention, were transparent, and the room, almost instinctively, saw the power reversal. I didn't shout. I didn't act out. The victory was elegant, slow, and deliberate. Social leverage, emotional intelligence, and timing converged to expose her arrogance. By the time the room had absorbed the subtle yet undeniable shift, the humiliation was complete. She was still physically present, but her influence, carefully built over decades, had evaporated in the space of a few strategically chosen words, gestures, and alliances. I felt the full weight of triumph, the satisfaction of months of planning coming to fruition. This was the moment where humiliation, status reversal, and emotional justice intertwined perfectly, and for the first time in years, I stood in a room of family and social peers as the person whose presence demanded respect, and they all knew it. After the party, I sat alone in the quiet of my home, the echoes of laughter, whispers, and gasps still ringing in my ears. I replayed every moment, every glance, every subtle shift in attention, and a slow, steady sense of satisfaction settled over me. My mother-in-law's forced smiles and strained politeness haunted me, but now they felt like proof, not pain. For years I had endured humiliation, overlooked slights, and subtle betrayals, and finally the scales had tipped. The feeling was almost dizzying, relief intertwined with triumph, an emotional cocktail I hadn't dared to imagine months ago. When I thought about my family's reactions, I could see the cracks, hesitation, and reevaluation in their eyes. My husband, though initially stunned, approached me quietly later. a mix of pride and newfound respect in his gaze. Cousins and distant relatives who had whispered doubts now smiled, acknowledged my achievements, and sought conversation. The audience of my social circle had witnessed the shift, and it was satisfying to know the quiet recalibration of perception was complete. In the solitude afterward, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here, the humiliation, the anger, the careful planning, and the quiet acts of leverage. Each step, every moment of patience, every restrained reaction had led to this emotional apex. I allowed myself to feel the full weight of empowerment, the knowledge that I had reclaimed my dignity, restored my sense of self-worth, and transformed the humiliation intended to crush me into a victory. The catharsis wasn't just in their recognition of my power. It was in my own internal reckoning. I had endured the emotional storms, faced the subtle cruelty, and emerged not bitter, but wise, deliberate, and strong. I realized that the true triumph wasn't just in the social victory. It was in the reclamation of my agency, in the clarity of knowing I could navigate this world on my own terms. I smiled softly, thinking back to the first night the divorce papers were handed to me like a weapon. What had felt like the lowest, most humiliating point had been the spark. It had ignited patience, strategy, and courage I didn't fully recognize I possessed. Now, in the aftermath, I felt grounded, confident, and victorious. The weight of humiliation had transformed into wings of empowerment, and for the first time in years, I felt fully, unshakably seen. The emotional high lingered, a mix of relief, triumph, and quiet pride. The journey wasn't over. There would always be challenges, but I knew I had crossed a threshold. The daughter-in-law they had underestimated was gone. In her place stood someone who could navigate betrayal, convert pain into strategy, and emerge not only unbroken, but triumphant. And that, more than any social applause or whispered admiration, was the ultimate reward. In the quiet days after the party, I took stock of everything I had endured and accomplished. The humiliation, the subtle betrayals, the underestimation, they had all shaped me, but they no longer defined me. I realized how much I had grown, how I had learned to set boundaries, recognize my worth, and navigate relationships with clarity and purpose. My mother-in-law's arrogance had taught me patience and strategy. Her cruelty had taught me resilience. I reflected on the justice I had quietly orchestrated, social, emotional, and personal. It wasn't loud or vengeful. It was deliberate, satisfying, and complete. Yet beneath the triumph, a faint bittersweet note lingered. Relationships had shifted irrevocably, some irreparably, and I understood that empowerment often comes with the cost of distance and change. Still, I felt an unshakable peace. I had reclaimed my dignity, affirmed my strength, and proven, to myself above all, that I could endure betrayal and emerge stronger. The weight of humiliation had been replaced by confidence and self-respect, and for the first time in years, I could move forward without fear, fully owning my narrative and my worth. Looking back now, I see the journey for what it truly was, a test of patience, resilience, and self-worth. The humiliation I endured, the subtle betrayals, the underestimation, they weren't just obstacles. They were lessons, shaping a version of me that could act with strategy, grace, and quiet power. Karma didn't need to strike loudly. It unfolded in measured, undeniable ways, revealing the truth to those who had tried to diminish me. Empowerment, I realized, isn't about loud victories or public applause. It's about reclaiming control, honoring your boundaries, and transforming pain into action that restores dignity. In orchestrating my quiet triumph, I learned that strength can be subtle, patience can be potent, and intelligence can be the most satisfying form of revenge. Now, when I reflect on that night, on the divorce papers that once threatened to break me, I feel pride, relief, and clarity. I am no longer the overlooked, underestimated daughter-in-law. I am someone who knows her worth, commands respect, and faces the world with confidence. The journey from humiliation to empowerment reminds me, and anyone listening, that injustice can be met with strategy. Pain can be transformed into power, and dignity, once reclaimed, is unshakable. Even after the party, the ripples of that night continued to spread. I noticed subtle shifts in family dynamics, glances exchanged, hushed conversations, and a new caution in the way some relatives approached my mother-in-law. Her confidence had been dented, and while she tried to maintain her composure, the undercurrent of doubt was undeniable. People who once followed her lead began questioning her judgment, and the social balance she had relied on for years was quietly tilting. I allowed myself a private smile, knowing the consequences of her arrogance were unfolding without my interference. I didn't need to push. The truth and perception were enough to reshape alliances, spark whispers, and sow uncertainty. Every minor correction, every recalibrated interaction, became a reminder that power can shift silently, and those who underestimate others often pay a hidden price. As I reflect on it, I also think about the rest of the family, the ones who stayed silent, the ones who enabled her behavior. Their loyalties, their complicity, and their assumptions about me were now being reevaluated. I knew some would adjust, some would distance themselves, and others might even quietly attempt their own power moves. But the lesson was clear. Actions have consequences, and underestimation comes with a cost. I share this not to boast, but to remind anyone listening that vigilance, patience, and strategic thinking can quietly restore justice. And perhaps, in the quiet of their own reflections, my family will recognize the full weight of their choices, sparking conversations, curiosity, and maybe even accountability.